intensive care. Or, let me be the one to remind you, don't play with that knife. By the way, you're welcome for saving your life. Alright? Albert is going to educate us on his hobby of radio scanning. Listen carefully, everyone, if this is something you're planning. Albert Ho. Cops, robbers, and hams. Cops, robbers, and hams. Albert Ho.
Thank you, Mr. Toastmaster. Fellow members and honored guests. Well, the first thing I'd like to do is take you back in time a little bit, and to take you back to the time when I was in high school. Right? So back then, your schedule was set for you. You didn't have to worry about going to work every day, just going to school to learn. And I had a friend of mine, his name was, we'll call him John for today, just for safety, in case I get him in trouble. And he was a bit of a slacker. He didn't show up to his classes all the time, so I knew that maybe he wasn't the kind of friend that I would want to hang out with all the time. So one day, he came up to me and said, "Hey Albert, take a listen to this." So he hands over a cell phone, and I said, "Okay, it's a cell phone." He says, "Take a listen." So I put it to my ear and listened. And I was stunned and shocked. I could hear two people talking already. I was wondering, how is that possible? How could I be hearing someone else's phone conversation? So from that day forward, it's what's become an old hobby of mine, which is radio scanning. So today I'm going to talk about ham radio. I'm going to talk about a bit of background about it. I'm going to talk about some of the licensing requirements, as well as some real-life situations where this could be used. So I'm sure you're wondering, why is it called ham radio? Because obviously, it looks like a cell phone. Why is it called hams? Well, back in the 1920s, mainstream radio operators actually, they would call amateur radio operators, they would call them hams as an insult. And from then on, amateur radio is known as ham radio. So from now, we'll be referring to it as ham radio. So just to give you a background of how radios work, in case you didn't know. So let's say you're driving along in your car, you're listening to the latest Britney Spears tune. You're actually listening to radio waves that have been transmitted from a local station to get to your car, which is the receiver, and that's how you're listening to the music. So I'm sure you're thinking, so to go back to my example of my friend John in high school, when I was listening to someone else's phone conversation, isn't that illegal? Well, actually it's not. There's actually, this falls under something called the Radio Communications Act, and it's actually perfectly legal, in Canada at least. Some US states don't allow it, but it's perfectly legal to own a device to listen to conversations as long as that what you hear, you don't pass it on to anyone else. And there's several reasons why the government does this. They figure that the airwaves are a public asset, right? We all own the airwaves in the sense that, because prior to television, there was no other way to communicate with the public. So the airwaves are so important that no company should own it. So we all have access to the airwaves. So when you think about ham radios, do you think it's actually used quite to this day? Well, in fact, it is. When you think of companies such as like trucking companies, or taxis, or even the TTC, they all still use radios to communicate with one another. So back after that first time that John showed me about his cell phone, what he had done, he'd actually programmed the cell phone to act as a receiver. I was thinking, well, how can I listen into more conversations like that? So I saved up some money, and I did some research, and I bought my first radio scanner, which is this device here, and you can pass it around. And that cost $163. So that was a lot of money. Don't turn it on right now. Yeah. It'll be distracting. So I saved up that money, and it was something that I really wanted, because after hearing about how we can legally listen in on people's conversations in a taxi cab, I really wanted to try it myself. And I used to listen for hours. So some common things that people listen to are policemen, right? They're listening to, they're responding to calls where there's shots fired, bang, bang, right? Or to firemen, they're actually fighting fires right here in the city. So I found it was quite exciting. I used to stay up all night listening to the radio and hearing their chatter back and forth. So the second thing I'm going to talk about is some of the licensing requirements. So I mentioned how it's perfectly legal to listen in on transmissions using a scanner, but to broadcast, you actually do need a license. So when you think about the CBC, for example, they actually have a license. So they are allowed to broadcast their music and programming over the airwaves, and they have a specific frequency, 99.1, which is what you dial on your dial. So they actually have something called a call sign. So their actual call sign is CBLA. So in a similar manner, hams are also licensed. So you need to take a course, and you actually get a sort of a series of letters and numbers, because it's not practical to identify yourself by your full name, right? So you actually get assigned a bunch of letters. So one example of an actual call sign is VO number 1 DK, and that would be someone's identifier when they're broadcasting on radio. So once you actually have your license, you're probably thinking, well, what do you do with this? Well, when you use ham radio, it's sort of like chatting on the internet. You could be talking to someone in the same room with similar interests or someone with no interest. But you can sort of pick and choose who you talk with. So it's sort of like making new friends. But keep in mind, you could also be making foes. And so the third thing was about the sort of licensing. So I mentioned that there's licensing. So there's actually 3 different types of licenses. So there's the first class called the technician class. The second one is called the beginner, and the third is called the extra. The basic differences between them is that the technician class, which I'm studying to take sometime in the future, it gives you a basic understanding of ham radio, and it gives you access to broadcast a certain distance. And as you go higher up the classes, you can broadcast on more frequencies and further distances. So the technician class, you can broadcast a distance of approximately 80 to 160 kilometers. So now the third thing I was going to talk about was how can ham radio be used in a real-life situation. So I mentioned some of the companies that might use ham radio, but what about in a more emergency situations? So think about back in 2005, Hurricane Katrina, right? It didn't affect us as much here in Canada, but certain states like Florida, Mississippi, and Louisiana were really hard hit, right? It was one of the top 5 worst storms in US history. Over 1 million people were displaced because of the storm. 1,800 people died. And in areas that were hard hit by the hurricane, power lines were knocked out, television signals were knocked out, there was no radio, television, or even electricity, right? So how are people going to survive? Well, ham radio actually had a very important role to play. So rescuers could actually communicate in the field using ham radio. So it would be a rescuer running on a battery-powered device, and they could communicate with home base for these search and rescue operations. And here in Canada, we actually have a similar network. It's called Amateur Radio Emergency Services, and this provides services all across Canada in case of emergency. So in conclusion, I hope you've learned a little bit about some of the legal rights of a radio scam, some of the different types of licenses, such as the technician license that I'm going to be studying, and also a real-life example of how ham radio was used. So maybe I'll hear you on the airwaves.